Every man who ever knelt before Duke Cadric Ardmore did so because the alternative had already been demonstrated. Not through speeches, not through written decrees nailed to village doors, through disappearance, through silence where a family's name once existed. In the northern kingdom of Valadorn, obedience was not a tradition. It was a scar tissue that grew over wounds no one dared reopen. And the man responsible for every wound sat alone tonight inside the war chamber of Blackthorn Keep, reading a royal letter that would change the architecture of his entire existence. What he did next would prove that even the most dangerous men in the kingdom could still be ambushed, not by armies, but by a single woman who refused to lower her eyes. The fire inside the war chamber had died 2 hours ago, but Caedric Ardmore had not moved to relight it. Cold did not bother him. Cold was where he had grown up, where he had learned to hold a blade before he learned to hold a pen, where his father had beaten strategy into his bones with fists wrapped in leather and silence that lasted for days. Blackthorn Keep sat perched above the Ashenmere cliffs like a clenched jaw overlooking the frozen sea, and everything about the fortress reflected its master. Obsidian walls, iron chandeliers that hung from cathedral ceilings like the skeletons of dead stars, windows of stained crimson glass that turned every corridor into a passage through dried blood. He read the royal letter a second time. The handwriting belonged to Chancellor Aldrich Morn, the king's voice in all matters of territorial law, but the order itself carried the crown's seal. Lord Edric Vale had been executed 3 days prior for high treason against the throne. His lands along the eastern ridge were forfeit, his title dissolved, his bloodline reduced to a single surviving daughter, Lady Seraphina Vale, who would be transported to Blackthorn Keep under royal guard to formalize an engagement with the Duke of the Northern Reach. The letter called it a union of fractured territories. Caedric recognized it for what it was, a leash dressed in lace. The crown feared him. They had feared him since the Heroin campaign 4 years ago, when he crushed 3 rebel provinces in 11 days and returned to court with the heads of their lords packed in salt. The king smiled at him during banquets now, but the smile never reached his eyes. And Caedric had been raised by a father who taught him that a ruler who smiles at you without reason is already calculating the cost of your funeral. Sending him a bride was not generosity. It was surveillance wrapped in silk. He set the letter on the stone table and pressed both palms flat against the surface. The cold bit into his skin. He let it. Hargrove. The door opened within 3 seconds. Captain Aldrin Hargrove stepped inside. A broad man with a face carved from decades of frontier war and a loyalty that had never once required testing. He stood at attention without being told. "The Vale woman arrives tomorrow," Caedric said without turning. "Prepare the East Tower. Staff it with 4 attendants. No one enters or exits without my knowledge." Hargrove hesitated. It was barely perceptible, a fraction of breath held too long, but Caedric heard it the way wolves heard heartbeats in snow. "Something you want to say, Captain?" "The East Tower hasn't been occupied since your mother's time, my lord." "I'm aware." "The court will talk." Caedric turned his head slowly. The firelight was dead, so Hargrove saw only the outline of the Duke's profile against the crimson window. Sharp jaw, eyes the color of iron left in rain, a stillness that felt more threatening than any raised weapon. "Let them." Hargrove saluted and left. Alone again, Caedric stared at the letter. Lord Edric Vale. He had met the man once, 6 years ago, at the King's Autumn Summit. A quiet lord with careful hands and careful words who governed his eastern lands with a patience Caedric found almost offensive. Treason seemed as natural to Edric Vale as cruelty seemed natural to a sparrow, which meant someone wanted him dead for a different reason entirely. Caedric filed that thought the way he filed all dangerous information, silently, behind a door in his mind that had no key anyone else could reach. He did not sleep that night, not because of the cold, not because of the letter, but because something in the phrasing of the royal order gnawed at him. The crown had dozens of unmarried lords closer to the eastern territories, wealthier lords, lords with better reputations, softer hands, names that did not make serving girls flinch in hallways. They chose him. That meant either they wanted the Vale woman watched by the most dangerous eyes in the kingdom, or they wanted her buried so deep inside Blackthorn that no one would ever hear her voice again. Either way, the crown expected him to be the cage. The thought should have felt familiar. It did not. Something about it sat crooked inside his chest, and Cadric Ardmore had not survived 31 years by ignoring the things that sat crooked. She arrived on a morning so cold the horse's breath turned to ice before it left their nostrils. Kedrick watched from the highest parapet of Blackthorn's northern wall, arms folded across his chest, black coat whipping in the wind that screamed off the ashen mere. Below, the royal convoy crawled through the fortress gates like a funeral procession, dressed in the wrong colors. 6 armored riders flanked a single carriage of dark wood and silver trim. No banners, no house colors. The crown had stripped every symbol of the Vale name from the transport, which told Cadric more about the political temperature than any intelligence report could. They wanted her forgotten before she arrived. The great hall of Blackthorn Keep could hold 300 men and still feel empty. Its ceiling soared above carved stone pillars darkened by centuries of torch smoke, and the floor was black marble veined with silver that caught the light like frozen lightning. Kedrick stood at the far end, positioned exactly where the morning light from the crimson windows would fall behind him, turning his silhouette into something between a man and a monument. He had learned stagecraft from his father, every entrance, every silence, every angle of the body designed to remind anyone watching that power was not simply held, it was performed, constantly, without interruption, because the moment you stopped performing it, someone in the room began to believe they could take it from you. The doors opened. Seraphina Vale walked in without escort. She had dismissed the royal guards at the threshold. Kedrick knew this because he heard the brief argument echo through the corridor, her voice low and steady against the captain's protest, before the heavy oak doors swung inward and she entered alone. She wore silver velvet that caught the cold light and threw it back like armor. Her dark hair was pulled away from her face in a style too severe for fashion, too deliberate for carelessness. Frost still clung to the hem of her traveling cloak, and she had not bothered to remove it, which meant she either did not care about appearances or understood that walking into the most dangerous hall in Valadorn wearing the evidence of her journey made her look like a woman who had survived something rather than a woman who had been delivered. The court was watching. 43 nobles, advisors, and military officers lined the walls of the great hall, arranged in descending order of rank, every one of them silent. They knew the protocol. When the Duke of Blackthorn received a guest, the room held its breath until he decided whether that guest would leave standing or kneeling. Seraphina stopped 12 feet from the stone dais where Cadric stood. The distance was deliberate, close enough for conversation, far enough to deny him the satisfaction of looking down at her from the elevated platform. She did not bow. She did not lower her eyes. She looked directly at him with an expression that carried no fear, no defiance, no performance of any kind, just assessment. The same flat, clear-eyed measurement a general might give a battlefield before deciding where to position the cavalry. The silence in the hall became a living thing. "Lady Vale," Cadric said. His voice filled the space without effort, the way thunder filled a valley. "Welcome to Blackthorn." "My father was executed 4 days ago," she replied. Her voice did not crack. It did not waver. It carried across the marble like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. "I was loaded into a carriage with no explanation and delivered to a man I have never met under orders I was never allowed to read. If this is welcome, I would hate to see your hospitality when you mean offense." Someone in the gallery drew a sharp breath. Kedrick studied her. He had expected grief. He had expected the hollow-eyed fragility that followed the sudden destruction of everything a person had known. He had seen it dozens of times in the faces of conquered lords' families. That glassy, disconnected stare of someone whose world had been kicked out from under them while they were still standing on it. Seraphina Vale looked like she had swallowed her grief whole and used it to rebuild her spine. "Your father was convicted by royal tribunal," Cadric said evenly. "Your presence here was arranged by the crown. I had no part in either decision. And yet you accepted both without question." The words landed like a slap delivered in perfect etiquette. He descended 1 step from the dais, just one, enough to let her understand that her sharpness had reached him without conceding that it had drawn blood. I accepted because refusing the Crown's directive would have given them reason to send you somewhere far less comfortable than Blackthorn. Somewhere you would have no voice, no servants, and no audience for your complaints. He paused. Let the silence do its work. Would you have preferred that arrangement? Seraphina's jaw tightened. It was the first crack in her composure, so small that no one in the gallery would have seen it, but Cadric saw it. He saw everything. It was the single skill his father had beaten into him that he actually valued. I would have preferred my father alive and my home intact, she said quietly. Since neither is available, I will take whatever arrangement allows me the dignity of being treated as a human being rather than a territorial acquisition. The great hall held its silence like a fist clenched around a secret. Kedrick stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Hargrove, who stood at the base of the dais with a face carefully emptied of reaction. Show Lady Vale to the East Tower. See that she has everything she requires. He did not look at her again. He did not need to. Her face was already carved into the back of his eyelids, and he knew, with the instinct of a man who had survived every kind of danger except the kind that wore silver velvet, that this woman was going to cost him something he could not calculate. But the first week passed in a war of architecture. Cadric governed Blackthorn the way a surgeon governed an operating theater. Every decision precise, every punishment measured not by anger, but by strategic necessity. A stable hand who stole grain received 30 days of labor reassignment. A minor lord who failed to pay his territorial tax received a visit from Hargrove's men that left no bruises but emptied every vault in the estate. Seraphina occupied the East Tower and immediately began violating every unwritten rule Blackthorn had operated under for 3 decades. She spoke to servants by name. She asked the kitchen staff about their families. She walked the lower corridors that the nobility never entered, where the working class of the fortress lived in narrow rooms with thin blankets and thinner meals. She asked questions about supply distribution. She asked questions about wages. She asked questions that no one had ever asked inside Blackthorn because asking them required acknowledging that the people who kept the fortress running were not furniture. Cadric learned about all of it. He learned because Blackthorn was his nervous system, every corridor a nerve ending that reported directly to his brain through a network of informants, loyal servants, and the simple mathematical reality that nothing happened inside these walls without eventually reaching his ears. He did not stop her. He told himself it was because her behavior was harmless, a grieving woman with too much time and no political power, playing at compassion to fill the hollow space where her old life used to be. Let her talk to the servants. Let her walk the lower halls. It would tire itself out like a flame in a jar with no air. But on the 7th night, during a formal dinner with 14 of Blackthorn's ranking nobles, he realized the flame was not dying. It was spreading. The dining hall glittered beneath the weight of 300 candles mounted in iron brackets along walls of carved stone. Long tables draped in black linen held silver platters of roasted game, smoked fish, winter root vegetables, and dark bread that Blackthorn's kitchens had perfected over generations. The nobles sat in their assigned positions dressed in the dark formal attire that Caedric's court demanded, and the conversation moved in its usual rhythm, careful, measured, every word filtered through the knowledge that the Duke was always listening. Seraphina sat at the far end of the table, where tradition placed the lowest-ranking guest. She had not protested the seating arrangement. She wore deep charcoal instead of morning black, a choice so precise in its political messaging that Caedric recognized it immediately. Black would have been a declaration of grief. Charcoal said something more dangerous. It said, I am not performing sorrow. I am enduring it quietly because I have more important things to do. Lord Rendall Ashwick, a minor territorial governor with a voice too loud for his significance, was holding court about the taxation of northern fishing villages when Seraphina interrupted him. How many people live in those villages, Lord Ashwick? Ashwick blinked. Being questioned by a woman at a formal dinner was not something his experience had prepared him for. That is not precisely the point under discussion. It is precisely the point. You are debating how much to extract from them. It seems relevant to know how many mouths will go unfed by the decision. Ashwick's face reddened. Lady Vale, the economics of territorial governance are considerably more complex than counting the people affected by them. I would argue they are not. A ripple of movement passed through the table. Heads turned. Eyes darted toward the head of the table where Cadric sat in absolute stillness, his winglass untouched, his expression unreadable. Ashwick looked to the Duke for rescue. The look said everything. Silence her. Correct her. Remind her where she sits and who she is. Cadric lifted his glass and drank. The dinner continued. Ashwick did not bring up the fishing villages again. After the guests departed, Cadric remained at the table alone. Hargrove entered to deliver the evening security report and found the Duke staring at the chair Seraphina had occupied as if it had spoken to him in a language he was still translating. She humiliated Ashwick, Hargrove said carefully. Ashwick humiliated himself. She simply provided the mirror. The court will not see it that way. The court sees what I tell them to see. Hargrove paused. 23 years of service had taught him the precise distance between speaking freely and crossing a line. She is not what anyone expected. Cadric stood. His chair scraped against the marble floor, and the sound echoed through the empty hall like a blade being drawn. No, he said. She is not. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became a month. The winter deepened around Blackthorn like a siege laid by the sky itself, burying the fortress under layers of ice and wind that screamed through the battlements with the voice of something starving. Cadric found himself adjusting his schedule around Seraphina's movements. He did not admit this to himself, which made it worse. He simply happened to pass through the east corridor during the hour she walked to the library. He simply happened to dine later on the nights she chose to eat in her chambers, because the alternative was sitting at a table where her empty chair occupied more space than she did. He simply happened to ask Hargrove for daily reports on her activities, and then spent too long reading them, searching for the patterns hidden inside her decisions, the way an intelligence officer searched intercepted letters for coded messages. She was not behaving like a hostage. She was not behaving like a bride. She was behaving like a woman who had decided, somewhere in the annihilating grief of losing everything, that if she was going to be trapped inside a fortress with the most feared man in the kingdom, she would make the fortress better instead of making herself smaller. And it enraged him, not because she was wrong, because every time she improved something he had neglected, every servant she fed properly, every supply chain she quietly questioned, every small cruelty she illuminated simply by being present, it forced him to see the architecture of his own rule from an angle he had spent 31 years avoiding. His father had taught him that power was maintained through fear, that people obeyed because they were afraid, and they stayed afraid because the consequences of disobedience were absolute. Edvard Ardmore had governed Blackthorn for 28 years under that philosophy, and when he died of a fever that ate through him in 3 days, no one in the fortress mourned. They simply transferred their fear to his son, the way soldiers transfer allegiance to a new commanding officer. Not out of love, but out of the understanding that the machine required someone at the top, and the machine did not stop. Cadric had never questioned the machine. He had inherited it the way he inherited his father's jaw and his mother's silence, and the cold that lived in the walls of every room he had ever occupied. You did not question the architecture of the house you were born inside. You learned its hallways. You reinforced its foundations. You made sure the roof did not collapse. Seraphina was asking why the house had no windows. He confronted her on a Tuesday in the East Tower's private study, where she had been reading through Blackthorn's territorial supply records with the focus of a woman building a case for prosecution. The room was small by the fortress's standards, stone walls lined with shelves of leather-bound ledgers, a single window overlooking the frozen sea, a desk of dark wood covered in documents she had no official authority to access, but which no one had thought to deny her because no one had ever wanted to look at them before. "You have been reviewing my administrative records," Cadric said from the doorway. Seraphina did not look up. "Your northern villages received 40% less grain allocation this winter than the southern estates. The disparity has existed for at least 3 years. The northern villages are smaller. The northern villages have harsher winters. They need more, not less." He stepped into the room. The space shrank around them. "You have no authority to review territorial allocations." Now she looked up. Her eyes were dark, steady, and completely unintimidated. "Then take the records away, lock the door, post a guard." You have the power to silence every question I ask, Your Grace. The question is whether you want to be the kind of man who does." The silence between them tightened like a wire pulled between two posts. Cadric felt something fracture inside his chest. Not break, fracture. A hairline crack running through a structure he had believed was solid stone. She was not attacking his authority. She was not challenging his position. She was standing inside his own fortress, reading his own records, and asking him whether the man he had chosen to become was the man he wanted to remain. No one had ever asked him that. No one had ever been close enough, brave enough, or foolish enough to stand in front of the Duke of Blackthorn and suggest that the walls he had built might also be a prison. "You do not understand how power works in this kingdom," he said quietly. "I understand exactly how it works. My father was executed by it." She stood. The desk remained between them, a barrier of wood and paper, and 3 decades of records documenting the slow calcification of a man's soul into administrative efficiency. "What I do not understand is why a man with the power to change any of this chooses not to. Because change is not free. Every resource redirected is a lever someone else can pull. Every mercy shown is a debt recorded by men who will use it against you when the time comes. I do not govern by kindness because kindness in this kingdom is a currency that buys nothing except a faster death." Seraphina studied him, not with anger, not with pity, with something worse, understanding. "Then you are not governing," she said. "You are surviving, and you have been surviving so long, you have forgotten there is a difference." He left the room without answering because every response he could construct felt like a confession. The court noticed everything. In a fortress governed by silence and observation, the Duke's shifting behavior registered like tremors before an earthquake. He had always been cold, controlled, and brutally predictable. Now he was distracted. His responses during council meetings arrived half a second later than usual. His gaze drifted toward the East Tower windows during strategy briefings. Minor infractions that would have drawn immediate punishment were overlooked or deferred without explanation. Lord Cassian Verlick noticed first. Verlick was everything Cadric was not. Charming, where Cadric was blunt, social, where Cadric was solitary, and patient, where Cadric was surgical. He governed the Silvermarch territories to the south with a warmth that endeared him to the common people and a ruthlessness that he kept hidden behind banquet smiles and generous donations to orphaned children. He had been waiting for Caedric's weakness, the way a hunter waits for winter to slow a stag. Verlick arrived at Blackthorn 6 weeks after Seraphina, ostensibly for the annual Northern Alliance Trade Summit. He brought 12 advisors, 30 guards, 4 carriages of diplomatic gifts, and an agenda written in invisible ink that had nothing to do with trade. Cadric received him in the war chamber. No fire, no wine, just stone walls, iron candle brackets, and the map table that held the territories of Valadorn carved in wood and metal like a dissected body. "You look tired, Ardenmore," Verlick said, settling into a chair with the ease of a man who believed every room was his. He was tall, fair-haired, and handsome in the way that made women trust him and men underestimate him. "You look comfortable for someone sitting inside a fortress that does not belong to him," Cadric replied. Verlick smiled. The smile was warm, practiced, and entirely hollow. "Always the gracious host. I hear congratulations are in order. The veil arrangement? The Crown's little matchmaking project. How is the lovely Lady Seraphina finding the northern hospitality?" "She is finding it. I imagine it must be quite an adjustment. A woman of her upbringing, accustomed to the gentler estates of the East, suddenly installed in this," he gestured at the bare stone walls, "architectural expression of emotional availability." Cadric did not react. Reacting was a currency he could not afford, especially in front of a man who collected emotional intelligence the way other lords collected taxes. "The trade summit begins tomorrow," Cadric said flatly. "You have your assigned quarters and your schedule, if there is nothing else." Verlick stood but did not leave. He leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the map table, his fingers spanning the carved wooden ridges of the northern territories. "I knew her father, you know. Edric Vale." His tone shifted. Something colder moved beneath the warmth. "Good man. Careful man. Not the type to commit treason. But then, The tribunals are so thorough these days, are they not? So efficient. The words hung in the cold air between them. Kedrick met Verlick's eyes. What he saw there was not hostility. It was something more dangerous. Amusement. The quiet satisfaction of a man who knows a secret and wants you to know he knows it without ever having to say it aloud. "Good night, Lord Verlick." Verlick straightened, adjusted his collar, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned. "A word of counsel, Ardmore, from one lord to another." His voice dropped to something almost intimate. "Be careful with what the crown sends you. Gifts from kings have a way of becoming obligations, and obligations, in my experience, are the only chains that do not show marks." He left. Kedrick stood alone in the war chamber for a long time after. The candles burned down to stubs. The wind screamed outside the narrow windows. The map of Valadorn lay before him, territories carved in wood and metal, borders drawn by generations of blood and negotiation, and the slow grinding machinery of ambition. Somewhere in the East Tower, Serafina was reading his records, asking questions no one had ever asked, and making the servant speak her name with something that sounded dangerously close to loyalty. Somewhere in the guest quarters, Cassian Verlick was smiling in a room full of advisors, dismantling something Kedrick could not yet see. And somewhere beneath the frozen surface of his own certainty, a hairline fracture was spreading through the foundation of everything he had built, whispering a truth he was not yet ready to hear, that the most dangerous threat to his kingdom had not arrived through the gates carrying a sword. It had arrived wearing silver velvet, and the second most dangerous had arrived smiling, with 12 advisors and a secret about a dead man that could set the entire north on fire. Cassian Verlick did not sleep his first night at Blackthorn. He did not need to. Sleep was a luxury designed for men who had finished thinking, and Verlick had not finished thinking in over a decade. He sat in the guest quarters with 3 of his senior advisors arranged around a table covered in territorial maps and coded correspondence. And he dismantled the Duke of Blackthorn's defenses the way a clockmaker dismantles a timepiece, gear by gear, spring by spring, until the entire mechanism lay exposed, and the only question remaining was which single piece to remove to make the whole thing stop. "He watches her," Verlick said, pouring wine into a glass he would hold but not drink from. Sobriety was another tool. Let others dull their edges at his table while he stayed sharp enough to cut. Every report confirms it. The servants, the guards, even his own captain sees it. Ardmore has spent 6 weeks pretending the Veil Woman is a political inconvenience while restructuring his entire daily routine around her movements. Marin Holt, his chief intelligence advisor, a woman with forgettable features and a memory that functioned like a steel trap, laid a folded document on the table. The grain allocations. She found the disparity in the northern supply records. Ardmore did nothing about it for 3 years. She read the ledgers for one afternoon and identified it within an hour. And he let her keep reading. Verlick smiled. It was the smile of a man watching a chess opponent accidentally sacrifice their queen while believing they were advancing a pawn. That is the part that matters. He did not confiscate the records. He did not restrict her access. He stood in the room with her, received her criticism, and walked away without disciplining her. When has Kedrick Ardmore ever walked away from a challenge to his authority? The question answered itself in the silence. "So we use her," said Lord Davin Rask, Verlick's military strategist, a man built like a siege engine with a mind to match. "We do not use her. We do not need to." Verlick set the wine glass down. The candlelight caught the surface of the untouched liquid like a small red eye watching from the table. "She is already doing our work without knowing it. Every question she asks weakens his foundation. Every servant who starts calling her name with warmth instead of fear is a brick pulled from his wall. We simply need to make sure the process accelerates. And if it does not, then we have the other lever." Verlick reached into his coat and produced a sealed envelope. The wax bore no insignia. Edric Vale's private correspondence, recovered from his estate before the Crown's men could burn it. 13 letters documenting a conspiracy that did not originate with Vale, because Vale was never a traitor. He was an investigator, and the men he was investigating are sitting in the King's Council chamber right now, wearing their loyalty like cologne to cover the smell of rot. Holt's eyes narrowed. "If we release that, not yet. Timing is the only ingredient that separates a weapon from a prop. We release it when Ardenmore is too distracted to respond, and the cord is too fractured to unite behind him. Until then, it sits in this envelope, and this envelope sits in my coat, and my coat stays on my body at all times. Rask shifted in his chair. You are gambling that obsession will override his instincts. Ardenmore is not a fool. No, he is something more useful than a fool. He is a man who has never encountered a vulnerability he could not eliminate through force, and the one vulnerability standing in his east tower cannot be eliminated through force without destroying the only thing in this fortress he has ever wanted to protect. Verlick picked up the wine glass again, held it to the light, studied the color the way a man might study a wound. That is not a fool, Lord Rask. That is a man in a cage he built himself. All we need to do is lock the door. The Northern Alliance Trade Summit began at dawn and descended into political theater within the first hour. 14 territorial lords gathered in Blackthorn's council chamber, a room designed for intimidation rather than negotiation. The ceiling was twice the height necessary. The windows were narrow and placed too high for comfortable light, forcing everyone at the table to sit in a perpetual gray twilight, broken only by the iron candelabras positioned to throw shadows upward across the faces of anyone who spoke. The chair at the head of the table was elevated 6 inches above the others, a detail Caedric's father had built into the room's architecture 3 decades ago, ensuring that every lord who sat at this table would spend the entire session looking slightly upward at the Duke. Caedric opened the summit with territorial reports, grain distribution, military readiness along the eastern border, trade tariffs with the coastal provinces. Each item delivered in his flat, precise cadence that left no room for interruption and no space for the kind of rhetorical flourishes that Verlick specialized in. But Verlick did not need flourishes today. He needed fractures. The fishing villages along the Coldmere coast, Verlick said during the tariff discussion, his tone conversational, almost bored. I noticed during my journey north that several of them appear to be in rather significant distress. Empty markets, thin livestock, children wearing summer clothes in the middle of winter. He paused, letting the image settle into the room the way smoke settles into fabric. I mention this only because I recall the Ardenmore Charter includes a provision for emergency resource allocation to vulnerable settlements during extreme winters. A provision that, unless I am mistaken, has not been activated in 4 years. Every head at the table turned toward Caedric. The trap was elegant. Verlick had taken Serafina's private criticism of the grain disparity and weaponized it in public, presenting the same argument with none of her sincerity and all of his strategy. If Caedric defended the allocation, he looked callous. If he acknowledged the failure, he looked weak. If he deflected, Verlick would push harder. And every lord at the table would watch the Duke of Blackthorn retreat from a policy question for the first time in recorded history. Caedric did not hesitate. Hesitation was a language his court spoke fluently, and he refused to give them a single syllable. The charter provision requires activation by majority council vote, Lord Verlick. You have served on this council for 9 years. You have never once raised the motion. The counter landed clean. Several lords shifted in their seats. Verlick's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes recalculated, the way a swordsman recalculates after a parry he did not expect. A fair point, Verlac conceded gracefully. Then perhaps this is the year we raise it. Shall I draft the motion? Draft whatever you like. We will vote on it at the next session. The exchange lasted 30 seconds. On the surface, it looked like routine policy negotiation. Underneath, both men understood exactly what had happened. Verlick had tested a wall. The wall had held. But the test itself revealed that Verlick knew where the cracks were, which meant someone inside Blackthorn was feeding him information, or he had found the same vulnerabilities independently. Either answer was dangerous. Caedric found Serafina in the East Tower Library that evening, sitting in a pool of candlelight with a book of territorial law open across her lap, and a cup of tea cooling beside her that she had forgotten to drink. He stood in the doorway for 11 seconds before she spoke without looking up. You can come in, or you can stand there projecting authority at the threshold, but you cannot do both indefinitely. He entered. The library was a narrow room with tall shelves and a single arched window that framed the frozen sea like a painting of something beautiful and completely indifferent to human suffering. He did not sit. Sitting would have surrendered the vertical advantage his body instinctively maintained in every room. Verlick raised the grain allocation in council today, he said. Now she looked up. The northern villages? Yes. Good. It was not good. He used the information as a weapon. He did not raise it because he cares about fishing families starving in the Coldmere settlements. He raised it because it made me look negligent in front of 14 lords who are already measuring the distance between my authority and his ambition. Serafina closed the book. The sound was quiet and final, like a door being shut. Then fix the allocation and remove the weapon. It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple. The villages are underfed. The grain exists. The only thing standing between the two is a decision you have been avoiding because making it would mean admitting the system you inherited is flawed. The system I inherited has kept this territory stable for 30 years. Stable for whom? The question hit something inside him that he did not have a name for. Not his pride. His pride was armored and battle-tested and could absorb direct hits without structural damage. This was deeper. This was the crawl space beneath the foundation where the things he refused to look at lived in the dark, feeding on the silence he maintained above them. He took a step closer. The candlelight shifted across his face, and for a moment the shadows carved his features into something that looked less like a duke and more like a man standing at the edge of a decision that would cost him regardless of which direction he chose. You think I do not know the system is flawed, he said. His voice dropped below its usual register, into the frequency he reserved for moments when control was a conscious effort rather than an instinct. You think I sit in that war chamber every night staring at maps because I believe every border is drawn correctly and every resource flows exactly where it should. Then why do you not change it? Because every change is a signal. Every reallocation tells someone in this kingdom that the structure they have relied on for decades is shifting beneath their feet. And the moment the ground shifts, every ambitious lord with a private army and a grudge starts calculating whether this is the moment to move. I do not govern through cruelty, Serafina. I govern through certainty, the certainty that nothing in this territory changes unless I decide it changes. Remove that certainty and you do not get reform. You get war. She stood. The book fell from her lap to the floor with a sound neither of them acknowledged. They were standing 4 feet apart now, close enough for him to smell the faint trace of winter air still caught in her hair from whatever walk she had taken along the parapets that afternoon. My father believed the same thing, she said, yet. Her voice was steady, but there was a current running beneath it, something raw and close to the surface that she was holding down with the same discipline Kaedric used to hold down everything. He governed the Eastern Territories with the same logic. Do not disturb the balance. Do not signal weakness. Maintain the structure. And the structure killed him, Kaedric. The men sitting inside that structure decided he was a threat to it, and they erased him. Not because he was a traitor, because he found something they did not want found. The use of his first name hit him like a hand pressed flat against his chest. No one called him by his first name, not his captains, not his council, not the servants who had known him since he was a boy learning to hold his father's sword with hands too small for the grip. His name inside this fortress was a title, a function, a wall between himself and everyone who existed on the other side of his authority. She had walked through that wall as if it were made of air. What did he find? Kaedric asked. I do not know. The Crown seized his documents before I could reach them. All I know is what he told me in the last letter he sent before the arrest. He said he had found evidence of a conspiracy inside the Royal Council. He said the men involved were powerful enough to make any accusation disappear and any accuser vanish. And he said, her voice faltered for the first time since she had arrived at Blackthorn, a crack so small it might have been a trick of the candlelight. He said that if anything happened to him, I should trust no one, especially the men who claimed to be his allies. The silence that followed was not the disciplined silence of Blackthorn's halls. It was the silence of 2 people standing inside a room that had suddenly become too small for the truth growing between them. Kaedric's mind worked the way it always worked, fast, cold, structural. Edric Vale had not committed treason. Vale had been investigating something inside the Royal Council. The Crown had executed him, not for what he had done, but for what he had discovered. And the architects of that execution were still sitting in positions of power, watching, waiting, making certain that whatever Vale had uncovered stayed buried. And they had sent his daughter to Blackthorn, not as a bride, not as a hostage, as bait. The realization restructured everything. If Seraphina's presence was designed to distract him while the real threat consolidated power behind the scenes, then every moment he spent watching her, thinking about her, adjusting his world to accommodate her existence, was a moment his defenses were oriented in the wrong direction. And yet, he looked at her standing there in the candlelight, her composure rebuilt after that single crack, her spine straight, her eyes carrying the weight of a grief she had converted into purpose because the alternative was drowning in it. He looked at her and he understood, with the brutal clarity of a man who recognized survival because he had practiced nothing else for his entire life, that Seraphina Vale was not drowning. She was swimming. In freezing water, in the dark, with no shore in sight. And she was doing it better than anyone he had ever met. "Your father's last letter," Cadric said. "Do you still have it?" "I burned it. He told me to. He said if the men he was investigating ever found it, the letter itself would become my death warrant." "Then everything you know about the conspiracy is in your memory." "Yes. Which means as long as you are alive, you are a threat to whoever ordered your father killed." The words landed between them with the weight of iron. Seraphina's expression did not change, but her breathing shifted. Shallower, faster. The body responding to a truth the mind had already processed weeks ago, but refused to fully confront until someone else said it out loud. "I have been a threat since the moment I arrived here," she said quietly. "The only question is whether the man they sent me to is part of the machinery that killed my father, or whether he is something else entirely." Cadric held her gaze. The candle between them guttered in a draft from the window, and for a moment the light flickered across both their faces, and they looked like two people standing on opposite sides of a fire that could either warm them or consume them depending on which direction the wind blew. "I am not part of it," he said. The words came out stripped of performance. No authority, no strategy. Just the raw, unfinished sound of a man saying something true for the first time in so long that the muscles in his jaw ached from the unfamiliarity. "Prove it." The proof came 3 days later, delivered not by Cadric's hand, but by Verlick's overconfidence. During the closing session of the Trade Summit, Lord Ashwick, the minor governor Seraphina had humiliated at dinner weeks earlier, rose from his chair and formally accused the Duke of Blackthorn of dereliction of his charter duties regarding territorial welfare. The language was legal and precise and bore none of Ashwick's usual rhetorical clumsiness, which told Cadric immediately that someone had written the accusation for him. Ashwick read from a prepared statement. His voice shook, but his words did not. The statement cited 14 specific provisions of the Northern Alliance Charter that Cadric had allegedly violated or neglected over the past 5 years. It referenced the grain disparities, the undertaxation of Verlick's southern territories, the concentration of military resources in Blackthorn at the expense of outer settlements. And buried in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought, it mentioned the Vale arrangement. The Duke's acceptance of the disgraced Vale daughter as a political bride raises serious questions about his judgment and his independence from crown manipulation, Ashwick read, his eyes never leaving the page. This council deserves assurance that the Duke of the Northern Reach governs for the North and not as an instrument of royal interference. The room went cold. Not metaphorically. Cadric felt the temperature change the way animals feel pressure drops before storms. Every lord at the table understood what was happening. This was not a policy complaint. This was the opening salvo of a political assault designed to isolate Cadric from his own alliance before he understood the shape of the attack. Cadric did not respond to Ashwick. He turned his head toward Verlick. Verlick was leaning back in his chair with his fingers laced across his stomach and an expression of concerned neutrality on his face that was so perfectly calibrated it might as well have been a signature on the accusation. "Lord Verlick," Cadric said. His voice carried the flat, dead calm that every man in the room recognized as the sound that preceded the worst decisions in Blackthorn's history. "Would you like to add anything to Lord Ashwick's statement? Perhaps a few paragraphs he forgot to read?" Verlick's smile flickered, just once, a candle in a draught. "I have no idea what you are implying, Your Grace. Lord Ashwick's concerns are his own. I merely share them." "You share them, as you shared the grain allocation concern 3 days ago. as you shared the charter provision that you yourself never invoked in 9 years of service. As you share, I imagine, the intelligence that informed a statement no one in this room believes Lord Ashwick wrote without assistance. Ashwick's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was a minor lord holding a weapon he did not know how to fire, standing between two men who had been building arsenals since before he understood what war looked like. Kedrick stood. The chair did not scrape this time. He rose like something mechanical, something that operated on a system beyond voluntary movement. Every lord at the table felt the shift, the moment the Duke of Blackthorn stopped governing and started hunting. This summit is adjourned. Lord Ashwick, you will present your formal accusations to my legal counsel within 48 hours, where they will be reviewed, documented, and responded to under the full weight of territorial law. If any provision of those accusations is found to be fabricated or submitted under external coercion, the consequences will be borne not by the man who read them, but by the man who wrote them. His eyes never left Verlick. Verlick stood slowly. The smile was gone now. In its place was something more honest and far more dangerous. Respect. The respect one predator gives another when both understand that the hunt has begun and only one of them will walk away from it. 48 hours, Verlick said mildly. That seems more than fair. He left the chamber first. It was a small victory, the act of turning his back on the Duke without being dismissed. But Kedrick let him take it. Small victories made men careless, and careless men made mistakes that careful men could not afford. That night, Kedrick went to the East Tower. He did not knock. He opened the door and found Seraphina standing at the window, staring at the frozen sea beneath a sky so thick with stars, it looked like the darkness itself was bleeding light. She turned. She saw his face. Whatever she read there made her go very still. Verlick has your father's correspondence, Kedrick said. He has been holding it as leverage. He is building a coalition to unseat me, and he is using your father's investigation as the foundation. Whatever Edric Vale uncovered inside the Royal Council, Verlick already knows what it is. And he is not planning to expose the conspiracy. He is planning to own it. Seraphina's hands closed at her sides. Not into fists, into something quieter and more deliberate than fists. The hands of a woman who had just learned that the man who destroyed her family had not done it out of malice or political necessity, but out of the simple, mechanical logic of acquiring a weapon he might need someday. "What do we do?" she asked. The word landed between them like a key turning in a lock neither of them had expected to open. "We." Not "what do you do, Duke?" Not "what will you decide, Your Grace?" "What do we do?" As if the space between them had collapsed without warning, and they were standing inside the same sentence for the first time, bound together not by royal decree or political architecture, but by the sudden irreversible understanding that the enemy surrounding them would destroy them both, unless they chose to stand on the same ground. Kedrick looked at her. The starlight from the window caught her face, and he saw something there he had never seen directed at him before. Not fear, not defiance, not the careful political neutrality she had worn like armor since her first day inside these walls. Trust. Fragile. Conditional. Earned by nothing more than the fact that he had walked into this room and told her a truth that made him weaker instead of a lie that made him stronger. He opened his mouth to answer. The door behind him crashed open. Hargrove stood in the frame, breathing hard, his uniform streaked with something dark and wet. Behind him, the corridor echoed with the sound of running boots and shouted orders ricocheting off stone walls. "My lord, 3 of our northern garrison commanders have been found dead in their quarters." Throats cut. All 3 were scheduled to testify at the next council session regarding border defense expenditures. The world narrowed to a single point. Kedrick felt it happen, the moment when a political game became a killing field. 3 commanders, dead simultaneously, inside his own territory, inside his own chain of command, which meant the assassins were already inside Blackthorn's network, already embedded, already watching and waiting and taking orders from someone who understood that the fastest way to dismantle a fortress was not to attack its walls, but to remove the men who guarded them. He turned back to Seraphina. Her face had not changed. Her breathing had not quickened. She stood there in the starlight with the calm of a woman who had already lost everything once and understood, with a clarity that most people never achieve, that the second time the world collapsed around you was not easier, but it was faster because you already knew what the falling sounded like. "It has started," she said. Kedrick looked at her, then at Hargrove, then at the corridor behind them, where the machinery of his entire world was grinding toward a war he had not chosen but could no longer prevent. "Yes," he said, "it has." And in that single word, the last door between peace and bloodshed closed behind them both, and neither one of them looked back. Hargrove's men recovered the bodies before dawn. 3 garrison commanders laid out on separate tables in Blackthorn's lower armory, throats opened with surgical precision, each wound identical in depth and angle, which told Kedrick 2 things immediately. The kills were performed by the same hand or by operatives trained under the same instructor. And the killer had accessed 3 separate quarters inside a military compound that required command-level clearance to enter, which meant the assassin either held that clearance or had been given it by someone who did. Kedrick stood over the bodies for a long time, not out of grief. He had not known these men well enough for grief. He had known them as functions. Commander Aldrich Wynne of the Northern Ridge Garrison, Commander Sarah Blackwood of the Coastal Watch, Commander Theron Mace of the Eastern Border Post. 3 names attached to 3 strategic positions along Blackthorn's outer defense perimeter. Removing them simultaneously was not an act of violence. It was an act of architecture. Someone was dismantling the structure of his territorial defense from the joints outward, the way you dismantled a bridge not by attacking the span, but by pulling the pins from the supports. Hargrove entered the armory carrying a leather folder. His face had the gray, compressed quality of a man operating on adrenaline and discipline, because the alternative was admitting that the world he had spent 23 years defending was coming apart faster than he could reinforce it. "Garrison reports from all 3 posts," Hargrove said, laying the folder on the table beside Commander Wynne's body with a precision that avoided looking at the dead man's face. "No signs of forced entry at any location. No disturbances reported by sentries. No witnesses. Because the sentries were either compromised or removed before the kills. That is my assessment as well, my lord." Kedrick opened the folder. 3 reports. 3 identical patterns. No evidence. No noise. No struggle. These men had died in their sleep or died so quickly after waking that the difference was academic. Who had access to command quarters at all 3 garrisons? Each garrison operates independently. There is no single credential that opens all 3. Then whoever coordinated this had separate access at each location. 3 different points of infiltration, 3 different networks. That is not an assassination. That is an infrastructure. He closed the folder. The sound echoed through the armory the way a coffin lid echoed in a stone chamber, a finality that had nothing to do with the object itself and everything to do with what it contained. Double the interior guard, restrict movement between the keep and the outer garrisons to authorize personnel only, and bring me the duty rosters for all 3 posts going back 6 months. Every name, every transfer, every leave of absence. If someone moved between those garrisons without documented reason, I want to know who approved it. My lord, that will take... Do it now, Hargrove. Chime. The council session that morning was a performance of controlled silence. 14 territorial lords sat around the same table where Ashwick had delivered his accusations the day before, and every one of them understood that the political theater had ended and something far more dangerous had replaced it. 3 dead commanders was not politics. 3 dead commanders was the sound of a kingdom clearing its throat before it screamed. Kedrick delivered the news without embellishment. Factual, chronological, stripped of the emotional architecture that lesser rulers use to manipulate their audiences. He watched their faces as he spoke, reading the micro-expressions the way his father had taught him, the slight widening of pupils that indicated genuine surprise, the controlled breathing that indicated rehearsed surprise, the absolute stillness that indicated a man who already knew what he was hearing because he had helped plan it. 6 lords showed genuine shock. 4 showed controlled concern. 2 showed nothing at all, which was its own kind of information. Verlick showed exactly the right amount of outrage. Not too much, not too little. The perfect calibration of a man who understood that performing horror at the right frequency was indistinguishable from feeling it. "This is an attack on the Alliance itself," Verlick said, his voice carrying the grave authority of a man stepping into a leadership vacuum that had not yet formed, but that he was already measuring. 3 commanders from 3 separate garrisons. This was coordinated, planned, executed with resources that suggest a threat far beyond a single disgruntled faction. He let the implications settle. The word he did not say hung in the air like smoke. The implication that Blackthorn's internal security had failed so completely that the Duke himself might not be capable of protecting the alliance he was sworn to lead. I have already initiated a full security review, Kadrick said. His voice hit the room like a blade laid flat on a table. Present, visible, not yet raised. The investigation is under my direct authority. Any lord who wishes to contribute intelligence may do so through Captain Hargrove's office. Any lord who wishes to obstruct the investigation will be treated accordingly. And what does accordingly mean precisely? Asked Lord Timon Greaves, a coastal lord with salt-weathered hands, and the careful neutrality of a man who had survived 30 years of northern politics by never committing to anything until the outcome was already decided. It means exactly what it sounds like, Lord Greaves. I encourage you not to test the definition. The session ended without resolution. No votes, no motions. No formal response to Ashwick's accusations, which now sat on the council table like an unexploded device that everyone was stepping around while pretending it did not exist. The lords filed out in careful silence, each retreating to their quarters to send coded messages to their estates, their allies, their intelligence networks. Every one of them recalculating the odds of a power shift they could either ride to elevation or be crushed beneath. Kedrick did not eat that day. He sat in the war chamber with the duty rosters Hargrove delivered at noon and read every name with the meticulous focus of a man defusing a bomb by tracing individual wires. 247 names across 3 garrisons, transfer records, leave approvals, disciplinary actions, medical absences. The pattern revealed itself at 4 in the afternoon. 7 men had transferred between garrisons in the past 8 months. 3 of those transfers had been approved by the same officer, a mid-level logistics captain named Davin Kare, who managed supply chain coordination between the northern garrisons. Kare's signature appeared on the transfer orders with a consistency that should have triggered an audit, but never did, because the transfers were small, routine, and buried inside a bureaucratic process designed to process volume rather than detect intent. 7 men, positioned across 3 garrisons, each one placed within access range of the commanders who were now dead. Kadrick called Hargrove. Find Davin Carr. Bring him to me. Do not let anyone see him arrive. Carr arrived at the war chamber 2 hours later, escorted through the servants' corridors by 2 of Hargrove's most trusted men. He was a thin man in his mid-30s with the unremarkable face and efficient posture of someone who had built an entire career on being overlooked. He stood before the Duke's table with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression arranged into the respectful blankness of a soldier awaiting orders. Kadrick studied him for 30 seconds without speaking. The silence was a tool. Most men filled silence with words, and words were where the fractures showed. Carr did not speak. He stood still and waited with the patience of a man who had been trained to endure exactly this kind of scrutiny. That was the first wrong thing. Logistics captains fidgeted. They shuffled papers, cleared throats, adjusted their uniforms. They were administrators, not field operatives. Kari stood like a man who had been interrogated before and learned to treat silence as a weapon rather than a threat. 7 transfers in 8 months, Kadrick said, all approved under your signature, all moving personnel between garrisons that are now crime scenes. Walk me through the rationale. Standard rotations, Your Grace. Supply chain efficiency requires periodic rebalancing of, do not give me the manual answer. I have read the manual. I wrote half of it. Tell me why 7 specific men were moved to 7 specific positions across 3 specific garrisons in a pattern that placed each one within physical access of a commander who is now dead. Carr's face did not change. That was the second wrong thing. A man falsely accused goes pale or goes red. A man justly accused either panics or calculates. Carr did neither. His face held the same blank efficiency it had worn when he entered the room, which meant he had prepared for this conversation, which meant he had known it was coming, which meant the assassinations were not the end of the operation. They were a phase. I processed the transfers through standard channels, Your Grace. I did not select the individuals. The requests came through the normal chain of command. Which chain? The garrison commanders themselves. The words hit Kadric like a door swinging open onto darkness. The garrison commanders, the dead men, had approved the transfers of the very operatives who killed them, which meant either the commanders had been deceived into signing orders they did not understand, or the orders had been forged using their authority, or the commanders themselves had been part of a larger operation and had been eliminated after serving their purpose. Each possibility was worse than the last. Who submitted the original request to the commanders? I do not have that information, Your Grace. The requests arrived through standard correspondence. I processed the paperwork. You processed the paperwork? Kedrick leaned forward. His hands rested on the table, fingers spread, pressing into the wood with enough force that the tendons stood out like cables. Captain Carr, I'm going to ask you a question, and the speed of your answer will determine whether you leave this room through the door or through the floor. Who gave you the order to move those men? Carr's composure cracked. Not much. A tremor in the left hand. A shift in breathing. One count longer on the inhale, which meant his body was preparing for something his mind had already decided. Fight or disclosure. One or the other. In the 3 seconds Kaedric gave him, the logistics captain made his choice. I want protection, Carr said. His voice dropped below the performance register into something raw and unfinished. My family. My wife and daughters in the Eastern Settlement. I want them moved to Blackthorn under guard before I say another word. You are not in a position to negotiate. Then kill me. And the names die with me, and whoever is behind this continues operating inside your walls while you stand here wasting time on a man who processed paperwork. The war chamber went silent except for the wind hammering the narrow windows and the sound of Kaedric's breathing, which had become slow and deliberate, and controlled the way a man's breathing became when every instinct in his body was telling him to reach across the table and extract the information through methods his father had used without hesitation and without regret. But his father was dead, and the methods his father had used produced a kingdom of terrified men who obeyed without loyalty, served without trust, and turned on each other the moment the fear was redirected. Kedrick had inherited that kingdom. He had maintained it. He had refined its cruelties into efficiencies and called it governance. And now it was collapsing from inside because fear built walls, but it did not build foundations. And the first serious strike against the structure was bringing everything down exactly the way Serafina had warned him it would. He made the decision in 4 seconds. It was the fastest strategic pivot of his life, and it felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. Hargrove, send 2 men to the Eastern Settlement. Bring Carr's family to Blackthorn under full escort. Comfortable quarters. No restrictions. Carr's shoulders dropped. Not much. Just enough to indicate that the wire inside his spine had lost a fraction of its tension. Now talk, Kadric said. Every name, every connection, every order you received and who delivered it. Carr talked. The name he gave was not Verlick. It was Hargrove. The word hit Kadric the way a blade hits bone, not with pain first, but with the hard material shock of something solid meeting something it should not have been able to penetrate. For a full 3 seconds, his mind refused to process what Carr had said. Not because the information was complex, because accepting it required dismantling a structure that had been load-bearing for 23 years. Hargrove. Aldrin Hargrove. The man standing outside this room right now. The man who had delivered the garrison reports that morning, with a face carefully arranged into the appropriate shade of distress. The man who had served Kaedric's father for 9 years, and Kaedric himself for 14, and had never once, in the entire architecture of that loyalty, given a single indication that the foundation was rotten. Explain, Kaedric said. The word came out flat and empty, stripped of every frequency except the one that communicated to Carr that the next 30 seconds of his life depended entirely on the quality of what he said. Carr explained. The operation had been running for 14 months. Hargrove had not initiated it. He had been recruited. The recruitment came through a channel Carr could not identify with certainty, but the money came from the south, routed through 3 intermediary accounts that terminated in the Silver March territories. Verlick's territories. Hargrove's role was infrastructure, access codes, patrol schedules, personnel placement, the quiet, invisible architecture of betrayal that only a man embedded in the center of the Duke's security apparatus could provide. "He does not give orders," Carr said. His voice had settled into the mechanical cadence of a man confessing because the alternative was worse than exposure. "He opens doors, transfers personnel when told, adjusts guard rotations to create windows. He is not the hand, he is the key." And the assassinations? Timed to coincide with Verlick's presence at the summit. The commanders were going to be called as witnesses regarding border defense spending. Their testimony would have exposed discrepancies in Southern Territory military contributions, discrepancies that lead directly to private forces being assembled outside the Alliance Charter. Private forces. The words landed with the weight of something Kaedric had suspected but never confirmed. Verlick was building an army, not through the Alliance, not through legal channels, through diverted resources and hidden recruitment, assembling a military force that answered to him alone, positioned outside the oversight of the Northern Alliance and beyond the reach of Blackthorn's intelligence network. And Hargrove had been helping him do it. How long has Hargrove been compromised? 14 months, as far as I know. But Captain Hargrove is careful. There may be deeper history I was never told. 14 months. Kedrick ran the timeline backward through his memory like a man rewinding a rope to find where the fray began. 14 months ago, Hargrove had accompanied him to the King's Winter Court. 14 months ago, Verlick had hosted a private dinner for Northern Alliance officers that Hargrove attended while Kedrick met with the Crown's military council. 14 months ago, the longest-serving, most trusted man in Kedrick's entire operation had sat across a table from Cassian Verlick and decided that the future of his loyalty lay somewhere other than Blackthorn Keep. The fracture that Seraphina's words had started weeks ago, the hairline crack running through the foundation of everything Kedrick had built, split open now into something structural and irreversible. Not because Hargrove had betrayed him. Men betrayed each other constantly in Valadorn. It was the currency of ambition, the transactional reality of a system built on fear rather than faith. The fracture came from understanding why. Hargrove had not betrayed him for money. Hargrove had been paid, yes, but a man with 23 years of service and a captain's quarters inside the most powerful fortress in the north did not sell his loyalty for gold. Hargrove had betrayed him because, after 23 years of serving a man who governed through terror and isolation and the systematic elimination of every human connection that might compromise his authority, Hargrove had looked at the architecture of his own life and seen nothing in it worth defending. Fear built obedience. It did not build loyalty. Kedrick had always known this in the abstract, the way a man knows that fire burns without having touched it. Now the fire was inside his chest, and the knowledge was not abstract anymore. It was alive, and it was consuming the framework of every assumption he had operated under since the day his father pressed a blade into his 12-year-old hand and told him that the only men you could trust were the ones too afraid to betray you. His father was wrong. His father was wrong. And the proof was standing outside this door wearing a captain's uniform and carrying 23 years of service that had meant nothing because it had been built on nothing, maintained by nothing, anchored to nothing except the cold mechanical understanding that obedience without devotion was a transaction, and transactions ended the moment someone offered a better price. Kedrick stood. He walked to the war chamber door. He opened it. Hargrove stood in the corridor, hands clasped behind his back, posture impeccable, face arranged in the familiar expression of professional readiness that Kedrick had relied on every day for over 2 decades. Their eyes met. Hargrove read the Duke's face the way a sailor reads a sky that has turned the wrong color. Not with surprise, but with the sick, settling recognition that the thing he had been dreading had arrived exactly on schedule. "My lord," Hargrove said. Just that. 2 words delivered in a voice that carried no defense, no denial, no performance. The voice of a man who understood that the distance between where he stood and where he would be in 60 seconds was measured not in feet, but in years, all of them suddenly worthless. "Step inside, Captain," Kedrick said. Hargrove stepped inside. Kerr sat at the far end of the table, staring at his own hands. The door closed. The three of them stood in the cold stone room with the maps and the candles and the 23 years of trust lying shattered across the floor between them, like glass from a window that had been struck from both sides simultaneously. "Is it true?" Kedrick asked. Hargrove did not pretend to ask what. He looked at his duke, the boy he had trained, the man he had served, the ruler he had ultimately decided was not worth the cost of his own life. And he answered with the only honesty he had left. Yes. One word. And in that one word, every corridor of Blackthorn shifted. Every shadow became suspect. Every locked door became a question mark. And the Duke of the Northern Reach understood with the full, crushing weight of a truth he could not outrun that the fortress he had spent his life defending had never been as strong as the walls suggested. Because the walls were not the problem. They never had been. The problem was that he had filled them with men who served him out of fear, and fear, in the end, was the cheapest loyalty in the kingdom. Sold to the first buyer who offered something Caedric Ardenmore had never thought to provide. A reason to believe the future looked different from the past. He stood in the war chamber with his captain's betrayal burning through the architecture of his certainty, and for the first time in his life, the Duke of Blackthorn did not know what to do next, only that, whatever it was, it would require becoming a man his father would not have recognized, a man he himself did not yet know how to be. And outside the walls, Verlick's machinery kept turning, indifferent to the wreckage it had left inside the only man standing between it and the throne. Kedrick locked Hargrove in the lower keep himself. Not the dungeons. The dungeons were for criminals, and what Hargrove had done existed in a category beyond criminality. It occupied the space where loyalty died and left a hole shaped exactly like the person who used to fill it. The lower keep was a stone room with an iron door and a single window too narrow for a man's shoulders, and Caedric closed that door with his own hands, because handing the task to someone else would have meant trusting another person inside his chain of command. And trust was a currency he had just discovered was counterfeit. He stood outside the locked door for 11 seconds, counted them, felt each one pass through his chest like a heartbeat made of something heavier than blood. Then he walked to the east tower. Seraphina was awake. She was always awake now, as if sleep had become a luxury she could no longer justify in a fortress where the floors themselves might be conspiring. She sat at the desk surrounded by her father's territorial maps, the ones she had reconstructed from memory over the past weeks, drawing borders and marking garrison positions with the steady hand of a woman who understood that knowledge was the only armor that could not be confiscated. She looked up when he entered and read his face the way a field surgeon reads a wound, not asking what happened, but assessing immediately how deep it went and whether the damage was survivable. "Hargrove," Kedrick said. One word, but it carried enough weight to collapse the silence in the room. Seraphina's hand stopped moving on the map. She did not gasp. She did not ask for confirmation. She processed the information with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had already survived the unthinkable once, and understood that shock was a reaction you could not afford when the ground beneath you was still shifting. How long? 14 months. Verlick recruited him. Money from the Silver March routed through intermediary accounts. Hargrove provided access codes, patrol schedules, personnel placement. The garrison commanders were killed using operatives he positioned inside the system. Who else? I do not know. That is the problem. If the man I trusted most for 23 years was compromised, any name on any roster in this fortress could be a weapon pointed at my back. He sat down. It was the first time Seraphina had ever seen him sit without strategic purpose. Not at the head of a table, not on an elevated dais, not in a chair positioned to maintain visual dominance over every person in the room. He sat in the wooden chair beside her desk, the way a man sits when the muscles that have been holding him upright for 3 decades finally acknowledge that the weight they have been carrying is not sustainable. I have spent my entire life building a system designed to make betrayal impossible, he said. His voice was quiet, not because he was performing control, but because volume required energy. He was redirecting elsewhere, toward the machine inside his skull that was already dismantling every assumption, every security protocol, every relationship in his command structure, and reassembling them under the new operating principle that nothing inside these walls could be trusted until it was verified from the ground up. Every lock, every guard rotation, every chain of command, all of it designed to make disobedience so costly that no rational person would attempt it. And the system worked perfectly, until it did not. Because I built it to prevent disobedience, and what Hargrove did was not disobedience. It was a choice, a calculated, rational, deliberate choice made by a man who weighed 23 years of service against whatever Verlick offered him and decided the service was worth less. Serafina watched him. She did not interrupt. She did not offer comfort. Comfort was not what a man like Kadric needed in this moment, and she respected him enough to understand that. What he needed was a mind sharp enough to match his own, working beside him instead of beneath him, processing the same catastrophic information and arriving at conclusions he might not reach alone because the betrayal had struck too close to the center of his identity to allow him clear sightlines. "The question is not why Hargrove betrayed you," she said. "The question is what Verlick is going to do next now that the betrayal has been exposed." Kadric looked at her. The shift was immediate, from a man absorbing a wound to a man analyzing a battlefield. She had done that deliberately, redirected him from the damage to the threat, from the past to the next 60 seconds. Carr talked. "Verlick does not know that yet, but he will know soon. Hargrove has not reported to him since yesterday evening, and a missed check-in from an embedded asset is the loudest silence in any intelligence operation. Verlick will assume compromise within hours, which means he accelerates. Yes. How fast?" Kadric's jaw tightened. "If I were him, tonight. He has 30 guards inside the fortress under diplomatic cover. He has unknown assets embedded in my own garrison. The 3 commanders who could have mobilized the outer defense perimeter are dead, and the man who controlled my internal security is sitting in a locked room in my basement." The mathematics of the situation laid themselves out with merciless clarity. Blackthorn's defenses had been systematically dismantled from within over 14 months. The outer garrisons were leaderless. The interior guard was potentially compromised. Verlick sat inside the fortress with an armed entourage and an intelligence network that had been operating undetected for over a year. And Kadric, who had governed through certainty and fear for his entire adult life, was standing in the wreckage of both with no one left to trust except the woman sitting in front of him and whatever remained of his own ability to think faster than the man trying to destroy him. "We need to move. Now." Serafina stood. The maps scattered across the desk shifted beneath her hands as she pulled the territorial overlay toward her and began marking positions. Verlick's private forces, the ones Carr mentioned, where are they staged? South of the Ashenmere Ridge. 2 days' march from Blackthorn under normal conditions. Less if they pre-positioned. Then we assume they pre-positioned. We assume everything we do not know is worse than what we do know, because every assumption Verlick has allowed us to maintain for 14 months was designed to keep us comfortable while he built the cage. Kadric looked at her. This woman who had arrived at his fortress as a hostage, who had challenged his authority at every turn, who had quietly illuminated every crack in the architecture of his rule while he watched her from across rooms and corridors, and the unbridgeable distance of his own inability to admit that what he felt for her was something beyond possession. She was standing over his maps now, reading his territories, thinking with his resources, operating inside his world as if she had always been there, and the months of hostility and resistance had been nothing more than the time required for 2 minds built for survival to recognize each other. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Planning. Because you need to stop reacting and start moving. Verlick expects you to lock down the fortress and conduct a purge of your own ranks. That is what your father would have done. Seal the gates, interrogate every man in the garrison, and spend 3 days establishing who is loyal while Verlick's private army marches within striking distance." "That is exactly what I was going to do." "I know, which is why you cannot do it. Verlick has been studying you for years. He knows your patterns. He knows you govern through compression, tighten control, restrict movement, eliminate variables. Every playbook you have ever used is a playbook he has already countered." The truth of it hit Kadric like cold water. Not painful, but shocking in its clarity. She was right. Every instinct in his body was screaming to lock the doors, restrict access, turn Blackthorn into the sealed fortress his father had designed it to be. And every one of those instincts was playing directly into Verlick's strategy because Verlick had built his entire operation around the certainty that Kaedric would respond to crisis the same way he always had, by becoming harder, colder, more controlled, more isolated, more alone. Then what do I do? The question cost him something. He felt it leave his body the way heat leaves a room when a window cracks open in winter. A small, specific loss that changed the temperature of everything it touched. He had never asked anyone that question, not his father, not Hargrove, not any advisor, commander, or lord in the entire history of his rule. He had always known what to do because knowing what to do was the fundamental requirement of being who he was, and admitting uncertainty in front of another person was an act of vulnerability his entire life had been designed to prevent. But his entire life had also produced Hargrove's betrayal, and the system that was supposed to make vulnerability unnecessary had failed so completely that clinging to it now was not strength. It was a man drowning while refusing to let go of the anchor because the anchor used to be a boat. Serafina met his eyes. You do something Verlick will never expect. You open the gates. So, the order reached every remaining loyal officer in Blackthorn within the hour, and it landed like a grenade in a library. Open the gates. Not metaphorically, not strategically. Literally open the main gates of the fortress, withdraw the interior guard to defensive positions along the inner keep, and send riders to every northern settlement within a day's range carrying a single message from the Duke of Blackthorn. The fortress is under threat from within. Any man or woman willing to stand for the north is welcome inside these walls. The officers who received the order responded with the silent, rigid obedience of men who had been trained to follow the Duke's commands without question. But their faces said what their mouths could not. This was madness. Blackthorn's power had always rested on its impenetrability. The closed gates, the high walls, the absolute control over who entered and who left. Opening the fortress was not a military strategy. It was an act of trust in a population that had spent 30 years being governed through fear. And that was exactly the point. Kaedric stood on the northern parapet at midnight, watching the riders disappear into the frozen darkness, carrying his message. The wind cut through his coat like a blade, and he let it. The cold was honest. It did not pretend to be something other than what it was, and right now honesty was the only resource he had left. Serafina stood beside him. Not behind. Beside. The way she had insisted on standing since the first day she walked into his great hall and refused to lower her eyes. He will come tonight, Kaedric said. Yes. My garrison is compromised. I do not know which men will fight for me and which will open doors for him. Then do not rely on men who fight for you. Rely on men who fight for themselves. The northern villages, the coastal settlements, the people you have governed for a decade, they do not need to love you to defend their own land. They need to believe that what comes after you is worse than what they have now. And is it? Verlick is building a private army to seize a kingdom. He orchestrated the execution of an innocent man to acquire political leverage. He embedded assassins inside your command structure and murdered 3 officers to blind your defenses. You may not be a kind ruler, Kaedric, but you are a predictable one. People understand the rules you enforce because you enforce them consistently. Verlick will enforce nothing except his own ambition. An ambition without structure is a fire that consumes everything it touches. Kaedric turned to her. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and she did not push it back. She stood in the cold the way she stood in every room, without apology, without performance, without any concession to the idea that the world around her should be more comfortable than it was. If this fails, he said, Verlick takes Blackthorn. He takes the northern territories. He takes whatever your father discovered and uses it to leverage the crown. And you, I know what happens to me. I will not let that happen. Then do not fail. Tokot. Verlick moved at 2 hours past midnight. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. The south gate, the eastern service entrance, and the main hall corridor, where 12 of Verlick's diplomatic guards shed their ceremonial armor and drew weapons that had been hidden inside their luggage crates since they arrived at the summit. The south gate fell first. 2 of Kaedric's garrison soldiers, men whose names had appeared on Carr's transfer lists, opened the reinforced doors from inside and admitted a column of armed men wearing no insignia and carrying short swords designed for close-quarters combat inside narrow stone corridors. The eastern entrance held for 9 minutes before the hinges were blown with an incendiary compound that scattered iron fragments across the service hall and killed 2 kitchen workers who had been sleeping in the storage rooms adjacent to the entry point. But the main hall assault stopped cold, because the main hall was empty. Verlick's 12 guards breached the corridor doors, expecting to find a skeleton garrison and a panicked duke retreating toward the inner keep. Instead, they found a hall stripped of furniture, lit by a single iron chandelier and occupied by one person. Serafina. She stood in the center of the great hall wearing a charcoal dress and no armor, holding nothing except a leather folder pressed against her chest, and she looked at the 12 armed men the way a woman looks at something she has already decided is beneath her fear. "Lord Verlick," she said, her voice carrying through the hall with a clarity that made every soldier hesitate. "Your men are in the wrong room." Verlick entered behind his guards, sword drawn, breath condensing in the frozen air. He scanned the empty hall with the rapid calculation of a man whose carefully orchestrated assault had just encountered a variable he did not account for. "Where is Ardenmore?" "Exactly where you did not plan for him to be." Verlick's eyes dropped to the folder. "What is that?" "My father's investigation, the one you recovered from his estate before the crown could burn it. You have 13 letters. I have the 14th, the one my father sent to the king's independent judiciary 3 days before his arrest, the copy he made because he knew the original would be intercepted. It names every member of the conspiracy inside the royal council, every financial transaction, every meeting, and it names you, Lord Verlick, not as an investigator, as a participant." The hall went silent except for the distant sounds of combat echoing through Blackthorn's corridors, steel on steel, boots on stone, the raw percussion of a fortress fighting for its own survival. Verlick's face underwent a transformation that lasted less than 2 seconds but covered a distance most men's faces never traveled, from confident control to recalculation to something cold and settled and final. "Killer," he said. The nearest guard raised his sword. The great hall doors behind Verlick exploded inward. Kedrick came through them like something that had stopped being entirely human and become instead the physical manifestation of every violent instinct he had spent 31 years refining into governance and was now releasing all at once, unfiltered, uncontrolled, aimed at the single point in the universe where a man had just ordered the death of the only person who had ever looked at him and seen something worth saving. He hit the first guard before the man's sword completed its arc. The impact drove them both into the stone floor with a sound like a tree falling on frozen ground. Kedrick's blade was already moving before he stood. A horizontal strike that caught the second guard across the forearm and sent the man's weapon spinning into the darkness. Behind him, 40 men poured through the doors. Not soldiers, not garrison troops. Villagers, fishermen from the Coldmere coast, laborers from the northern settlements. Men and women carrying axes and hammers and iron tools, and the raw, unpolished fury of people who had been told their land was under attack by a southern lord who wanted to add their homes to his collection. They had come. Serafina's strategy, Kedrick's impossible, irrational, suicidal strategy, had worked. The riders he sent into the darkness had reached the nearest settlements, and the people who had spent a decade living under the Duke's cold authority had made a choice. Not out of love for Kedrick, not out of loyalty to a man who had governed them through fear and efficiency. Out of the simple, furious, territorial understanding that whatever the Duke of Blackthorn was, he was theirs, and the man trying to take their land was not. The battle inside the Great Hall lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of steel and blood, and the deafening acoustics of combat inside a stone chamber designed to amplify the voice of whoever stood at its center. Verlick's guards fought with professional precision, but they were outnumbered and unprepared for opponents who fought with the desperate, unschooled ferocity of people defending their own ground. Kedrick fought through the hall toward Verlick with a focus that narrowed the world to a single corridor of intention. Every strike was aimed at closing distance. Every movement sacrificed defense for speed. He took a cut across his left shoulder that opened the fabric of his coat and the skin beneath it in a line of bright, immediate heat. He did not stop. He took an elbow to the jaw from a guard he had not seen approaching from his right side. His vision went white for a fraction of a second, and when it returned, his hands were already finishing the counterstrike that put the guard on the floor. Pain was information. His father had taught him that, the only lesson from the old man that still held true. Pain told you where the damage was, and damage told you what you could still afford to lose, and what you could still afford to lose told you exactly how much further you could go before the machinery stopped working. And right now the machinery had enough left in it to reach the man standing at the far end of the hall with a sword in his hand and the expression of someone watching a chess game collapse into a fistfight. Verlick was waiting for him. They met in the center of the great hall, beneath the iron chandelier, on the same black marble floor where Serafina had first refused to bow. Verlick was taller, faster with a blade, trained by the southern academies that produce swordsmen the way factories produced precision instruments. Kedrick was bleeding from the shoulder, half deaf from the blow to his jaw, and running on a fuel source that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the fact that the woman standing 15 feet behind him had just risked her life to buy him enough time to get here. And if he fell now, she would be dead before his body cooled. Their blades met. The impact ran up Kedrick's arm like voltage through wire. Verlick smiled. It was the last real smile he would ever produce. The expression of a man who still believed he was the predator, still believed the game was operating according to his design, still believed that the Duke of Blackthorn was the same man he had studied for years, the man who governed through fear and control and the cold mechanical precision of a system that had just been demonstrated conclusively and irrevocably to be broken. "You should have stayed behind your walls, Ardenmore," Verlick said through gritted teeth, pressing the blade. "You were always better at hiding than fighting." Kedrick absorbed the press. His shoulder screamed, his vision pulsed at the edges. The blood from his wound was running down his arm into his grip, making the sword handle slick and treacherous. "I was never hiding," Kedrick said. "I just had nothing worth coming out for." He dropped his weight beneath Verlick's blade and drove forward. The move was not elegant, it was not trained. It was the instinct of a man who understood, in the marrow of his bones, that the difference between survival and destruction was not skill or strength or strategy, but the willingness to sacrifice the part of yourself that was afraid of losing in order to become the version of yourself that could not be stopped. His blade found Verlick's side. Verlick staggered, his sword arm dropped. His eyes went wide with the particular disbelief of a man who had spent years building the perfect machine and was now discovering that machines break when they meet something that does not operate by mechanical rules. They locked together, blades crossed, faces inches apart, breath mixing in the frozen air between them. "Your father's letters," Verlick hissed through the pain. "The 14th copy. It does not exist. She is bluffing." Kedrick looked at him. Blood ran down both their arms. The hall echoed with the dying sounds of combat as Verlick's remaining forces collapsed under the weight of a population that had decided for the first time in a generation that their land was worth fighting for. "It does not matter if it exists," Kedrick said. "You believed it did, and that is enough." Verlick's eyes changed. The calculation drained out of them, replaced by something raw and cornered and final. The look of a man who understood that the game was over, not because he had been outfought, but because he had been outread. Serafina had stood in this hall with an empty folder and a voice steady enough to make a lie indistinguishable from truth. And Verlick had believed her because his own guilt made the 14th letter not just plausible, but inevitable. Verlick gathered everything he had left. Kedrick saw it coming. The desperate surge of a man with nothing behind him except defeat, and nothing ahead of him except the choice between surrender and one final strike aimed at taking his enemy down with him. The blade came up fast, aimed at the throat. Kedrick shifted. Not enough. The steel caught the side of his neck, a shallow cut that opened the skin in a line of fire from jaw to collarbone. Blood sheeted down his chest. His vision narrowed to a tunnel with Verlick at its center. Behind him, Serafina's voice cut through the chaos. One word. His name. Not a scream, not a plea. A command. The voice of a woman who refused to watch the man she had chosen to stand beside die on the floor of his own hall because he was too stubborn to let someone else share the weight. Kadric heard it, not with his ears, with the part of himself that had been sealed behind iron doors for 31 years, and was now, in this moment, standing in the open air for the first time, unprotected and terrified and alive in a way that made every previous version of his existence feel like a rehearsal for the only performance that mattered. He drove the blade forward with everything left in his body. The steel entered Verlic's chest. The rebel lord's sword clattered to the marble. Their eyes met one final time. Verlic's mouth opened. No words came. Just the quiet, wet sound of a man whose machinery had finally stopped. Verlic fell. Kedrick stood over the body, swaying, bleeding from the shoulder and the neck, and a dozen smaller wounds he had not catalogued yet. The great hall was silent now except for the labored breathing of the villagers and the dying crackle of torches that had been knocked from their brackets during the fight. He turned. Seraphina stood where she had stood throughout the entire battle. In the center of the hall, leather folder still pressed against her chest, eyes locked on his. The folder was empty. He knew that now. She knew he knew. And neither of them would ever speak of it because the lie she had told had been the truest thing in the room. Not true in content, but true in function. True in the way that only a bluff built on absolute conviction and delivered with perfect composure could redirect the course of a battle and the fate of a kingdom. He took one step toward her. His knees buckled. The marble floor came up to meet him with the indifference of stone meeting everything. Kings and beggars and dukes who had just won wars they did not yet know the cost of. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Seraphina running toward him, and the last thing he felt was her hands on his face, and the last thing he heard was her voice saying his name again, not as a command this time, but as something else entirely. Something that sounded like the first word of a language neither of them had ever been taught, but both of them were learning, syllable by syllable, in the wreckage of everything they had been and the uncertain architecture of everything they were about to become. He woke to pain in the smell of iron, not the iron of chandeliers or the iron of Blackthorn's ancient fixtures. The iron of his own blood dried into the fabric beneath his body, crusted along the side of his neck where Verlic's blade had opened a channel that the fortress physician had closed with 19 stitches, while Kaedric lay unconscious on the floor of the great hall. The shoulder wound required 23 more. The physician told him later that the neck cut had missed the artery by the width of a fingernail, a measurement so small it existed in the space between living and dying, the way a whisper exists in the space between silence and sound. Kaedric opened his eyes. He was in the East Tower, Seraphina's quarters. The realization arrived before his vision fully cleared, the angle of light from the narrow window, the smell of candle wax and cold stone, and the faint trace of winter air that Seraphina carried in her hair from her walks along the parapets. He was lying on her bed, beneath her blankets, inside the room she had occupied since the day she arrived at Blackthorn, as a hostage wrapped in royal orders and silver velvet. She was sitting in the chair beside the desk, watching him. The leather folder, the empty one, the bluff that had redirected a battle, sat closed on the desk behind her like a prop from a play that had ended but whose stage had not yet been struck. How long? His voice came out raw, scraped hollow by unconsciousness and dehydration and the particular exhaustion that follows the complete expenditure of everything a body has to give. 2 days. He tried to sit up. The shoulder screamed. The neck wound pulled against its stitches with a bright, specific agony that made his vision pulse white at the edges. He sat up anyway, because lying down in front of another person while conscious was a vulnerability his nervous system refused to accept, regardless of what his muscles thought about it. The fortress. Secured. Verlic's remaining forces surrendered before dawn. 31 prisoners in the lower keep, 9 dead, including Verlic. The south gate and eastern entrance are under repair. The inner walls held. The villages. 47 men and women from 4 northern settlements fought in the hall and the corridors. 11 wounded, 2 dead. She paused. The pause carried weight. Not hesitation, but the deliberate silence of a woman choosing her next words with the precision of someone placing stones on a scale. They are still here. They have not gone home. They are sleeping in the great hall, eating from the fortress kitchens, and waiting. Waiting for what? For you to come down and tell them what happens next. Kadric stared at her. The morning light from the window crossed her face at an angle that showed the exhaustion she had been carrying for 2 days. The shadows beneath her eyes, the tension in her jaw that came from clenching it too long, the slight tremor in her hands that she controlled by keeping them folded in her lap with a discipline that mirrored his own. She had not slept. She had been running the fortress while he bled on her bed, making decisions that were not hers to make inside a hierarchy that had never acknowledged her authority. And she had done it anyway because the alternative was letting the machinery stop. And she understood, the way he was only now beginning to understand, that the machinery mattered more than the question of who had permission to operate it. You kept the fortress running, he said. Not a question. Someone had to. You had no authority. No, I had necessity. Authority is what you give yourself after necessity forces you to act. Every ruler in history built their legitimacy backward. First, they did what had to be done. Then they constructed the title that justified it. She unfolded her hands and placed them flat on her knees. I am not claiming your title, Kadric. I am telling you that while you were unconscious, your fortress needed someone to make decisions, and I made them. If any of them were wrong, correct them. If any of them were right, do not thank me. Just get out of bed and finish what we started. He looked at her for a long time. The silence between them was not the disciplined silence of Blackthorn's corridors, or the strategic silence of the war chamber, or the oppressive silence that his father had used as a weapon to keep everyone around him uncertain and off balance. It was the silence of two people sitting inside a room that had become, without either of them planning it, the only honest space in the entire fortress. A room where performance was no longer possible because they had both seen each other at the exact moment when performance collapsed, and the raw, unfinished truth of who they actually were stood exposed in the open air. Kadric swung his legs off the bed. The floor was cold against his bare feet. He stood. The room tilted for a moment, then steadied. Pain lanced through his shoulder and neck in alternating waves, and he let it come without resisting because resistance required energy, and he needed every unit of energy he had left for what came next. I need clothes, he said. On the chair behind you, the physician cut your coat off. I had the steward bring a replacement. He dressed slowly, every movement a negotiation between intention and damage. The new coat was black, identical to the one that had been destroyed, because Blackthorn's stewards understood that the Duke's wardrobe was not fashion, but infrastructure. Every element calibrated to project the same image, the same authority, the same unyielding surface that told anyone who looked at him exactly who they were dealing with. But when Kadric caught his reflection in the window glass, the man looking back at him was not the same man who had worn this coat before. The face was the same, sharp jaw, iron gray eyes, the architecture of controlled severity that he had inherited from his father and maintained through 3 decades of practice. But something behind the architecture had shifted. The way a building looks the same after an earthquake, but the foundations have moved, and the walls that were load-bearing before are now carrying weight along different lines, redistributing the stress of the entire structure through paths that did not exist before the ground shook. He had been broken open, not by Verlick's blade, not by Hargrove's betrayal, by the moment on the parapet when he asked Serafina what to do and meant it, by the moment he opened the gates and trusted a population he had governed through fear to fight for something larger than their fear of him. By the moment he heard her say his name in the Great Hall and understood that the sound of it in her voice was the first time his own name had ever meant something other than a title or a threat. He was not a different man. Wolves did not become different animals because they learned to run with a pack instead of hunting alone. But the wolf that ran with a pack understood something the solitary hunter never could. That strength was not diminished by proximity. That allowing another creature to cover your blind side was not weakness, but the highest form of tactical intelligence. That the most dangerous predator in any territory was not the one with the sharpest teeth, but the one that had finally learned what was worth protecting. "Ready?" Serafina asked from behind him. He turned. She was standing now, smoothing the front of her dress with a gesture that was not vanity, but preparation. The same gesture a soldier makes when checking armor before walking onto a field. "One thing first," he said. He crossed the room to where she stood. 3 steps, each one deliberate. each one closing a distance that had existed between them since the first moment she walked into his great hall and looked at him without kneeling. A distance measured not in feet, but in the accumulated weight of every wall he had built, and every wall she had refused to acknowledge. He stopped in front of her, close enough to see the pulse in her throat, close enough to see that her breathing had changed, not faster, not slower, but deeper, as if her body was drawing in air to fortify itself against whatever was about to happen. You stood in that hall with an empty folder and told a man with 12 armed soldiers that you had evidence that could destroy him, Kadric said. You did not know if I would reach you in time. You did not know if the villagers would come. You stood there alone and you gambled your life on a bluff because it was the only move that gave everyone else a chance to survive. It was the correct move. It was insane. Those are not mutually exclusive. He almost smiled. The muscles in his face resisted it. They had been held in the same position for so many years that any deviation felt structural, as if smiling might crack the facade and bring the entire exterior down. He did not smile. But something behind his eyes shifted, and Seraphina saw it, and what she saw there made her go very still. I do not know how to do this, he said. His voice dropped below every register he had ever used in public, below command, below authority, below the flat strategic monotone he deployed in council chambers and war rooms. This was the frequency that existed beneath all of them, the original sound of a man speaking without armor. I do not know how to stand in front of someone and offer something other than control. Every tool I have was built for dominance. Every instinct I carry was designed to prevent exactly this. Standing in front of another person without a strategy, without leverage, without the certainty that I can predict what happens next and engineer the outcome. Seraphina looked at him. Her eyes were steady, dark, and completely unafraid. Not because she did not understand the weight of what he was saying, but because she had been carrying her own version of the same weight since the day her father died and the world she knew was replaced by one she had to build from wreckage. You are doing it right now, she said. Badly. Yes, but you are doing it, and that matters more than doing it well. He reached out and took her hand. The contact was not romantic in any way the poets of Valadorn would have recognized. No swept hair, no trembling declarations, no orchestrated moment designed to satisfy an audience. It was two hands connecting across the space where everything they had been taught about power and survival and the cost of human connection said they should never touch. His hand was rough from sword work and cold from the stone floor. Hers was steady and warm and did not pull away. They stood like that for a long time. Two people in a narrow tower room holding on to each other with the grip of survivors who understood that the storm had passed but the rebuilding had not yet begun. And the rebuilding would be harder than the storm because storms required only endurance while rebuilding required imagination. The ability to look at wreckage and see architecture, to look at absence and see possibility, to look at a man shaped by cruelty and isolation and see someone worth standing beside. Come on, Seraphina said. They are waiting for you. The great hall had been cleaned but not repaired. The marble floor still bore the scars of combat, gouges where blades had struck stone, dark stains that the servants had scrubbed but could not fully erase, the scorched outline near the south entrance where the incendiary compound had burned through the doorframe and left a permanent shadow on the wall. 47 villagers sat on the floor and on makeshift benches arranged along the walls. They were fishermen, laborers, farmers, tradespeople, the working foundation of the Northern Territories who had never set foot inside the great hall of Blackthorn Keep because this hall was designed for nobility and they were designed in the architecture of the system Kedric had inherited to remain invisible. They were not invisible now. Kedric entered through the main doors. Seraphina walked beside him, not behind. The arrangement was deliberate, and every person in the hall understood it because they had spent their lives reading the body language of power, whose wife walked 3 steps behind, whose advisor stood at the left shoulder, whose servants moved with their eyes lowered. Seraphina Vale walked at the Duke's side with her chin level and her stride matching his, and the message required no interpretation. He stopped at the center of the hall, the same spot where Verlic had died, the same spot where Seraphina had stood with an empty folder and a voice that did not shake. He looked at the faces arranged around him, weathered, tired, bruised, some bandaged from wounds sustained during the fighting, and he saw something he had never seen directed at him before. Not fear, not the careful blankness of people performing obedience while calculating the cost of disobedience. Something raw and less organized than either of those. Something that looked like the beginning of trust, but not the finished product. The rough, unpolished first draft of a relationship between a ruler and his people that had never existed before because the ruler had never given it space to grow. He spoke. 2 nights ago, I sent riders to your villages asking for help. I did not order you to come. I did not threaten consequences for staying home. I asked, and you came. You fought inside walls that have never welcomed you, beside a man who has never earned your loyalty, against an enemy that most of you had never seen before that night. He paused. The silence in the hall was not the disciplined silence he had maintained for decades. It was the silence of people listening to a man say something they did not expect him to say. I am not going to stand here and tell you that I have been a good ruler. I have not. I have governed this territory the way my father taught me. Through fear, through control, through the systematic elimination of every variable that might threaten the structure of power I was raised to maintain. That system produced stability. It also produced a kingdom where no one inside these walls trusted anyone else, where loyalty was a transaction rather than a choice, and where the man I relied on most for 23 years sold me to an enemy because I gave him nothing worth defending except his own survival. He felt Serafina's presence beside him. Not touching, not speaking, just there. The way a foundation is there, unseen, unacknowledged in the daily experience of living inside a structure, but carrying the weight of everything above it. That system failed, not because it was attacked from outside, because it was hollow from the center. I built walls that could withstand any siege and filled them with people who had no reason to hold them. That is not governance. That is architecture without purpose. And I am done building it. He looked at the faces. The fisherman from the Coldmere coast with a bandage wrapped around his forearm and eyes that held the flat, unsentimental assessment of a man who dealt with dangerous things daily. Storms, tides, nets full of thrashing weight, and understood that the most important quality in any leader was not strength, but reliability. The woman from the northern settlement who had fought in the corridor with a woodcutter's axe and now sat with her back against the wall and her hands resting on her knees with the exhaustion of someone who had spent everything she had and was waiting to find out if the expenditure was worth it. The old man from the ridge village who had not fought at all but had walked through the darkness to bring a cart of medical supplies because he understood that wars were won by the people who kept others alive, not only by the people who made others die. I cannot promise you a gentle kingdom, Kadric said. The North does not produce gentle rulers, and I would not trust one if it did. But I can promise you a kingdom that sees you, that counts you when it counts its resources, that does not treat your labor as invisible and your lives as expendable. A kingdom where the gates are not a barrier between the people inside and the people outside, but a threshold that anyone can cross when the territory they share is under threat. He stopped speaking, not because he had run out of words, but because the words he had left were the kind that could only be proven through action, and standing in a hall making promises was the easiest part of any transformation. The difficult part came tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that, the slow, unglamorous, grueling work of rebuilding a system while living inside it, of changing the foundations of a house without being able to move out first. The fisherman from the Coldmere coast stood up. He did not speak. He looked at the Duke for a long moment, measuring, assessing, running the same calculation every person in the hall was running. Is this real? Will it last? Can this man become what he is describing, or is this the temporary contrition of a ruler who survived a crisis and will revert to his old architecture the moment the danger passes? The fisherman nodded. Once. A single downward motion of the chin that communicated neither enthusiasm nor commitment, but something more valuable than both. The willingness to wait and see. To give the man a chance to prove his own words before accepting or rejecting them. The hardest kind of trust to earn because it was the most honest. One by one, others nodded. Not all of them. Not a sweeping wave of dramatic approval. Individual decisions made by individual people, each one carrying the weight of a lifetime spent under a system that had never asked for their input and was now, for the first time, acknowledging that their input was the only thing that had saved it. Bots. The weeks that followed were not triumphant. Triumph was a word for stories that ended at the climax. Reality continued past the climax into the territory where victory decomposed into logistics, and logistics decomposed into the daily, repetitive, unromantic business of making decisions that no one would celebrate because they were too small to be dramatic and too necessary to be ignored. Kadrick restructured the garrison command. 3 new commanders, selected not from the aristocratic officer class that had produced Hargrove, but from the mid-level ranks, Omochek, men and women who had served without ambition and without complaint, whose loyalty had never been tested because no one had considered them important enough to corrupt. He promoted them personally, in the war chamber, looking each one in the eye with the understanding that trust was no longer something he could manufacture through fear, but something he would have to build through consistency. One kept promise at a time. The grain allocation to the northern villages was corrected within the first week. Serafina oversaw the redistribution with the administrative precision of a woman who had been trained to govern a territory before that territory was taken from her. She did not ask for Kadrick's permission. He did not require her to. The old system would have demanded formal authorization through 3 levels of bureaucratic oversight. The new system operated on a simpler principle. The right thing done quickly was worth more than the perfect thing done too late. Hargrove was tried before a tribunal of 6 territorial lords, 3 military officers, and 2 civilian representatives from the northern settlements. The trial lasted 4 days. The evidence was comprehensive and the verdict unanimous. Hargrove received a sentence of permanent exile from the northern territories, his rank dissolved, his name struck from the military registry. Kadrick could have executed him. The old system demanded it. The old Kadrick would have done it without hesitation, because mercy toward traitors was a signal that invited more betrayal. But Kadrick sat through the sentencing hearing and looked at the man who had served him for 23 years, the man who had trained him in sword work and security protocol, and the 1,000 small operational details that kept a fortress functioning. And he understood something about punishment that his father had never taught him, because his father had never learned it. Execution eliminated a threat. Exile answered a betrayal. But neither one addressed the failure that produced the betrayal in the first place, and that failure was not Hargrove's. That failure was the system itself. The cold, efficient, inhuman machinery that turned loyalty into a transaction and left men with no reason to stay except the fear of what would happen if they left. Killing Hargrove would have been the old architecture asserting itself one final time. Letting him live was the first brick in the new one. The royal court sent a delegation 6 weeks after the battle. 3 advisors in ceremonial robes carrying a letter from the king that expressed concern about the civil disturbance in the northern territories and requested a full accounting of events. The letter was diplomatic in tone and threatening in structure, the kind of correspondence that offered support with one hand while positioning the other hand behind its back. Kadrick received the delegation in the Great Hall. Serafina sat beside him. The territorial lords were arranged along the walls. The civilian representatives from the northern settlements were seated for the first time in the gallery where only nobility had sat before. A detail so unprecedented that the royal advisors spent more time staring at the commoners in the aristocratic section than they did reading their own letter. Kadrick's response was brief, factual, and carried a single embedded message that the advisors would decrypt later and deliver to the king with varying degrees of alarm. The northern territories were stable. The threat had been neutralized. The Duke of Blackthorn would continue to govern as the alliance required. And the internal restructuring of northern governance was an internal matter that the crown was welcome to observe but not invited to direct. The delegation left the next morning. 2 of the 3 advisors looked relieved. The third looked thoughtful, which was the dangerous one, the one who understood that what was happening in Blackthorn was not simply a change in administration, but a change in kind. A ruler who governed through fear was predictable, containable, manageable. A ruler who governed through something else, something that did not yet have a name in the political vocabulary of Valadorn because no one had attempted it in living memory, was an unknown variable, and unknown variables made crowns nervous. Let them be nervous. Kadric had spent his entire life making people afraid. He was not interested in making people nervous now. He was interested in building something that would still be standing after he was gone, and fear did not outlast the man who wielded it. It died the moment the source of it died, leaving nothing behind except relief and the immediate scramble to replace one tyrant with the next. What he was building now, this fragile, untested, imperfect structure of governance that included the people it governed and drew its strength from their participation rather than their submission, might survive him, might outlast Blackthorn itself, might become the foundation that the next ruler inherited instead of the cage. Or it might collapse. He understood that. Every day he woke in the East Tower, their tower now, hers and his, the room where he had first admitted that he did not know what to do, and she had answered not with comfort but with strategy. He understood that the structure he was building had no precedent in Valadorn, no manual, no guarantee. He was constructing it the way all lasting things were constructed, through error and correction and the willingness to keep working after the errors accumulated, to the point where most men would have walked away and returned to the system they knew. He did not walk away. Spring arrived late in the north, the way it always did. Not as a gentle warming, but as a violent negotiation between winter and the sun, the ice fighting for every inch of ground before surrendering in sudden, dramatic collapses that sent waterfalls crashing down the Ashenmere cliffs and turned Blackthorn's frozen courtyards into rivers of meltwater that the servants channeled through ancient drainage systems carved into the stone by builders whose names no one remembered. Kadric stood on the northern parapet on the first morning that the wind did not carry frost. Seraphina stood beside him. Below, the fortress courtyard showed the early activity of a changed world. Villagers from the Coldmere settlements arriving with the week's fish trade, garrison soldiers conducting drills alongside civilian volunteers who had been integrated into the territorial defense after the battle, servants moving through the open gates with the unhurried pace of people who no longer flinched at the sound of boots in corridors. "Your father would not recognize this place," Seraphina said. "My father would have burned it down and started over." "Is that what you think?" He considered the question the way he considered all of her questions now. Not as a challenge to be countered, but as an angle of vision he could not access alone. His father would have seen the open gates and the villagers in the courtyard, and the servants who made eye contact with the Duke when they passed him in the halls, and he would have seen weakness, disorder, the erosion of the controlled environment that had kept the Ardenmore dynasty in power for 3 generations. But Edward Ardenmore was dead, and his controlled environment had produced a son who spent 31 years governing a kingdom of terrified strangers, until the strangers stopped being terrified and the kingdom nearly fell. The old man's system was not wrong because it was cruel. It was wrong because it was incomplete. It accounted for the human capacity for fear and failed to account for the human capacity for everything else. Loyalty that was chosen rather than coerced, service that was offered rather than extracted. The stubborn, irrational, strategically indefensible decision to fight for something larger than your own survival because the alternative was living in a world where nothing was worth fighting for. "I think my father built the best system he knew how to build," Kadric said, "and I think he would have despised what I am building in its place, and I think he would have been wrong." Seraphina leaned against the parapet wall. The wind moved through her hair, and for the first time since she arrived at Blackthorn, she looked like a woman standing in a place she had chosen to be rather than a place she had been sent. "The delegation from the East arrives next week," she said. "They want to discuss restoring the Vale territories under a joint administration. I know. It would mean returning my family's lands to governance, under my name." He turned to her. The morning light caught the scar on his neck, the thin white line from Verlick's blade that the physician said would never fully fade, a permanent record written on his body of the night everything changed. "Under your name," he repeated. "Is that a problem?" "Seraphina, nothing about you has ever been a problem. You have been an earthquake. You have been a siege. You have been the single most disruptive force this fortress has ever encountered, including the man who tried to burn it down. But you have never been a problem." Something happened to her face. Not a dramatic transformation. Not the sudden collapse of composure that happened in stories where the heroine finally breaks down and shows her vulnerability in a way designed to make the audience weep. It was smaller and more real than that, a softening around the eyes, a slight release of the tension she carried in her jaw the way he carried it in his shoulders. The invisible armor of a person who had learned to hold themselves together through discipline because the alternative was falling apart in a world that did not stop for people who fell apart. That might be the closest thing to a compliment you have ever given anyone, she said. It was not a compliment, it was a threat assessment. She laughed. It was quiet, brief, and carried the particular warmth of someone who had learned to find humor in the space between what was said and what was meant. The space where Ceadric Ardenmore, Duke of Blackthorn, ruler of the Northern Territories, the most feared man in a kingdom built on fear, lived every moment of his life because he had never learned to say the thing he actually meant until a woman walked into his hall and refused to accept anything less. He took her hand, the same gesture from the tower room weeks ago when he held on to her in the wreckage of everything they had been. But it was different now. The grip was not a survivor's grip. It was steady, deliberate, chosen. The hand of a man who was learning, slowly and imperfectly, and with the daily accumulation of small failures that all honest learning requires, to hold on to something without crushing it. The Vale Territories under joint administration, he said. Your name on the charter, full autonomy on internal governance, military coordination through Blackthorn. Those are terms. Those are a beginning. She looked at him. He looked at her. The frozen sea below the cliffs was breaking apart, massive sheets of ice splitting and drifting into the current with a sound like the world clearing its throat before saying something important. The sun climbed above the eastern ridge and hit the obsidian walls of Blackthorn Keep, and for the first time in the fortress's history, the black stone caught the light and held it instead of absorbing it, and the walls that had always looked like a monument to darkness glowed with the brief, improbable warmth of a surface learning to reflect something other than its own shadow. They stood on the parapet together, not as duke and hostage, not as ruler and subject, not as the roles that a kingdom built on domination had assigned them. As two people who had walked through the worst version of themselves and come out the other side carrying something that could not be named with the vocabulary of power, because it had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the quiet, terrifying, irreversible decision to stand next to another person and mean it. Below them, Blackthorn opened its gates to the morning, and for the first time in 30 years, the fortress did not look like a clenched jaw. It looked like a door.